Before the break, in the last segment, you had basically walked us through what you found. You have obtained leaked documents. These are internal FBI documents, counterterrorism documents, where they outline the potential threats that they see in the coming years ahead. You have documents from that outline the threats in 2018, in 2019, and 2020. One of these threats, before this document was leaked, was known to be a category called Black Identity Extremists. That seems to be a euphemism for Black Lives Matter. That came out of the Ferguson protests. A month ago, they were questioned by members of Congress about this, and the head of the FBI said, we've gotten rid of that designation. But it turns out that these documents that you show say that they actually haven't gotten rid of the designation. They have just genericized the term to racially motivated extremist groups or something to that effect. And they have lumped it in with white supremacists. And so, I mean, I think most people have a vague awareness, but can you tell me the number of terror attacks, domestic terror attacks, however you want to determine it, that have been perpetrated that could even be remotely related to this notion of Black identity extremism, whatever that means, versus the ones that are explicitly white supremacist. And we know they're explicitly white supremacists, not just by the nature of who they've attacked, but in many cases, there have been some, screeds or at least a trail online. Like, I'm trying to think of the time where we have a white church shot up, or where we have, white shoppers shot up by a black person, a Black identity extremist.
Well, the FBI actually had problems finding examples too, because if you look at their definitions of, the two components of racially motivated extremists, for the, Black identity extremists, they don't cite a single example. And then you go over to the white supremacist one, and they have, if I recall, half a dozen. So it's not just, us that it seems difficult to find cases. The FBI themselves couldn't, at least according to these documents.
So that's stunning. So do they have other threats that they've listed up there that are, that's a hypothetical threat, right? If you can't point to a single example of violence coming from some kind of supposed domestic terror movement, you're just talking about something completely hypothetical, right? They could easily have just put in there frothing radio hosts who seem to have a problem with the American way of life. That could be in there. There'd be just as much evidence that, people like me represent a threat, a domestic terror threat.
Yeah, I think it's extremely concerning. And what's odd is that they actually assert that there has been, violence, political violence perpetrated on the part of Black identity extremists, but they don't cite any examples. They just assert it. And then when you go to the white supremacist portion, they cite extensively all of these different cases. So it appears that they believe that it's happening, but at least according to the documents, they don't mention anything.
Now, can you see on this documents that there are references to other domestic terror threats that seem to be, as far-fetched as this? I guess the real problem is that they're lumping it in with a real threat, as in white supremacy, right? I guess my point is this, is that I can contemplate the idea that the FBI would and probably should, present hypothetical threats, right? Like, it's conceivable that we're getting some sense that all of these radio hosts are banding together, and maybe we're picking up chatter that they're talking about buying weapons or whatever it is. And I could see that you would put that in, like, we have a category of threats, hypothetical threats, we call them, where there's, it's not a real threat, but it could potentially be a threat. How do they break these down, or is it just numbered? And to the extent that it's numbered, like, how do you put as a tie between white supremacists who have killed, tens of people, scores of people at this point in the past several years, versus another group that hasn't seemed to have even injured anybody, that hasn't done anything, that we can't even point to anybody who would be a member of this domestic terror movement.
Yeah, well, they organize them by what's called, I think it's called threat bands. And so, racially motivated violent extremism, as they call it, that's at the very top. That's in the, topmost band. And what I thought was a little shocking was, it's in the same band as ISIS, and beneath it, threats that are considered, less of a counterterror concern are Al-Qaeda and basically all of its affiliates, Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. So again, it's difficult because we don't know now that they've collapsed white supremacists and black identity extremists in the same term. They could say, oh, well, actually we're taking the, white supremacy threat very seriously, but we don't know because they don't.
So here's the bottom. Here's the bottom line is that what we're looking at is not just their assessment of threats, but we're looking at a plan on how they're going to expend their resources. And exactly. Now they can come from it and tell Congress, yes, we are. Are you handling the white supremacist domestic terror threat seriously? Yes, we are. We're expending a lot of money on what we call racially motivated violence. And they could literally be talking about, oh, we have people spying on the leadership of Black Lives Matter.
Right. Right. And I want to add one more thing. One of the most incredible things to me was it's not apples to apples. They don't, because I know people are going to, look at this and say, oh, well, why not just put the different races into one thing so that you don't treat them discreetly or whatever. And, on its face, that might seem to make sense, but they don't actually define black identity extremists and white supremacists in a sort of apples to apples fashion. They describe black identity as the word suggests. And if you look at the documents, they stress a notion of like a separate black, homeland and personhood. And it's all about how they conceive of their personhood. And then when they describe white supremacists, they don't that notion of one's personal identity. That's not how they define it. They define it more in much different terms. And so I would encourage people to look at that gulf between how they're
the point being that the threshold to call someone a black identity extremist is much lower than it would be to call someone a white supremacist.
I believe so, yes.
Well, this is fascinating work, and people should check it out. We will obviously people should check out your work here, Ken Klippenstein. Piece is entitled "Leaked FBI Documents Reveal Bureau's Priorities Under Trump" for TYT. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.